There are some stories American history tried to bury, not by accident, but deliberately. Stories so disturbing, so fundamentally challenging to the narratives we've been told, that they were quietly erased from official records, whispered about only in the darkest corners of collective memory, then forgotten entirely. What I'm about to tell you is one of those stories, and I warn you now, once you hear it, you won't be able to forget it. August 14, 1827, Charleston, South Carolina. A wealthy plantation owner lies dead in his library, his skull crushed with such devastating force that bone fragments are embedded in the mahogany desk 6 feet away. The killer, a woman who stood nearly 7 feet tall, weighed over 240 pounds of solid muscle, and vanished into the humid southern night without leaving a trace. For almost 200 years, historians have asked the same haunting question: was Sarah Drummond real, or just a ghost story born from guilt and fear? But the court documents don't lie. The medical reports don't lie. The eyewitness testimonies don't lie. Sarah Drummond was absolutely real. And what happened in that library was the inevitable conclusion of a horror that had been building for 4 brutal years. This is her story. Before we dive deeper into this incredible tale, I want to ask you something. If stories like this fascinate you, real historical mysteries that blur the line between documented fact and terrifying legend, hit that subscribe button right now. And leave a comment telling me where you're watching from. These forgotten American stories deserve to be remembered. Now, let's go back to where this nightmare truly began. Sarah Drummond's story doesn't start with violence, it starts with money. Spring 1823, the Charleston harbor is chaos, ships arriving weekly from the Caribbean, from West Africa, from Virginia's tobacco fields, all carrying the same cargo: human beings bought and sold like livestock. Charleston isn't just any port city, it's the beating heart of America's domestic slave trade. A place where fortunes are made through the buying and selling of human souls with the same casual efficiency as cotton bales or sacks of rice. The rice plantations surrounding Charleston are death traps. Unlike cotton fields, rice cultivation means standing in swamp water for hours. Water teeming with malaria, carrying mosquitoes, venomous snakes, and alligators lurking just beneath the surface. The mortality rate is staggering. Historical estimates suggest nearly 30% of enslaved workers die within their first year in the rice fields. This creates a perverse economy. Plantation owners constantly need fresh bodies to replace the dead. March 1823. A slave trader named Caleb Rutherford arrives in Charleston with 37 people he's purchased across Virginia and North Carolina. Among them is a young woman, maybe 19, maybe 20 years old. She immediately draws attention for one unmistakable reason. She is enormous. Auction house records describe her as standing near 7 feet in height, with a frame of unusual breadth and musculature. Witnesses report she has to duck through doorways. Her hands are so large they can wrap entirely around a man's head. Her name, according to the documents, is simply Sarah. Modern medicine would recognize her condition as pituitary gigantism, a rare disorder caused by excess growth hormone. But in 1823 there's no such understanding. To the people staring at her, Sarah is a freak of nature, a curiosity, and potentially a very valuable one. The auction takes place on a humid Tuesday morning in late March. The auction house on Chalmers Street is packed. Planters, merchants, curious onlookers who've heard rumors about the giant woman. When Sarah is brought onto the platform, shackled at the wrists and ankles, a murmur ripples through the crowd. She stands nearly a full head taller than the auctioneer, a portly man named James Vanderhorst who's conducted thousands of these sales. But even he admits to friends later, he's never seen anything quite like her. The bidding starts at $400, already a substantial sum. Within minutes, it climbs to $800, then $1,000. Planters shout their offers, each trying to outbid the other. They see in Sarah not just a worker, but a spectacle. Someone who could draw visitors. Someone who could be displayed. The winning bid comes from a man standing near the back of the room. His name is Josiah Crane, and he pays $1,300 for Sarah Drummond, one of the highest prices ever recorded at a Charleston auction that year. Crane is a rice planter who owns Marsh Bend Plantation, about 18 miles southwest of Charleston, deep in the network of tidal swamps and meandering rivers. He's 42 years old, a widower, and has a reputation among other planters as a man who runs his plantation with an iron fist. As Sarah is led away from the auction block, a leather collar burned with Crane's property mark now around her neck, witnesses report that she never makes a sound. She doesn't cry, she doesn't resist. She simply stares straight ahead with dark, unreadable eyes. No one at that auction could have known what they'd just witnessed. They couldn't have known they were watching the beginning of a story that would end in blood, mystery, and a legend that would haunt the Low Country for generations. But perhaps they should have suspected something. Because according to the records, as Crane leads Sarah to his wagon for the journey to Marsh Bend, one old woman in the crowd, a free black woman who sells flowers near the market, is heard to say, "That man just bought his own death." Marsh Bend Plantation is everything the Low Country is known for, and everything that makes it a living hell for those forced to work there. The main house, a two-story Georgian structure with white columns and a wide veranda overlooking rice fields stretching toward the Ashley River. Behind it the kitchen building, the overseer's cottage, a barn, a rice mill, and a row of 12 slave cabins made of rough, hewn timber with dirt floors and no windows. Beyond those, hundreds of acres of carefully engineered rice paddies connected by an intricate system of dikes, ditches, and floodgates. When Sarah arrives at Marsh Bend in late March 1823, she's assigned to cabin number 7, which she'll share with 5 other women. The overseer, a thin, nervous man named Porter Grimble, seems visibly unsettled by her size. In a letter to his brother that still exists in the South Carolina Historical Society archives, he describes Sarah as creature of such unnatural dimensions that she must stoop to enter the cabin. When she stands at her full height, she resembles some ancient colossus more than a Christian woman. But Josiah Crane hasn't paid $1,300 for Sarah to simply work the fields. He has something else in mind. Within the first week of her arrival, Crane begins exhibiting Sarah to visitors. He invites neighboring planters, Charleston merchants, even traveling gentlemen to Marsh Bend specifically to see the giant negress he's acquired. Sarah is brought to the main house, made to stand in the parlor or on the front veranda, ordered to demonstrate her size and strength. Crane has her lift heavy objects, barrels filled with rice, iron anvils, even full-grown pigs. He stands next to her so visitors can see the dramatic difference in their heights. He has her extend her hands so men can place their own hands inside hers and marvel at the difference. A diary entry from a Charleston physician named Dr. Edmund Porcher, who visits Marsh Bend in May 1823, provides a chilling glimpse. He writes, "Crane has acquired a female specimen of most extraordinary proportions. She stands at least 6.5 feet in height, perhaps more, with hands and feet of such dimension that I could scarcely credit my own measurements. Her strength appears commensurate with her size. I observed her lift a barrel of rice weighing no less than 300 pounds with apparent ease. I confess the sight of her produced in me an unsettling sensation, as if nature herself had been experimenting with proportions beyond the normal boundaries of the human form." For Sarah, these exhibitions are only the beginning of her suffering. When she's not being displayed for Crane's guests, she's put to work in the rice fields under conditions that would break most people within months. Workers wade into flooded fields before dawn, standing in water up to their thighs for 10 to 12 hours at a time, bent over in the scorching sun planting, weeding, harvesting rice. The water is brackish, filled with leeches and water moccasins. The air hums with clouds of mosquitoes. The heat is suffocating. Sarah's extraordinary size makes her both an asset and a target. She can carry loads that would require 2 or 3 normal workers. She can operate the heavy wooden pestles used to thresh rice with a speed and power that astounds even the overseer. But her visibility also makes her vulnerable. When Crane wants to make an example, to demonstrate what happens to those who work too slowly or show defiance, he often chooses Sarah. Not because she's done anything wrong, but because punishing someone of her size sends a message that no one is beyond his reach. The punishments are savage: whipping posts, wooden stocks, a device called the buck, where a person is forced to sit with their knees drawn up, a stick placed under their knees and over their arms, effectively immobilizing them in an agonizing position for hours. Sarah experiences all of these, but Sarah doesn't break, at least not in the way Crane expects. According to testimony from other enslaved people at Marsh Bend, testimony collected years later under very different circumstances, Sarah becomes someone the community both fears and relies upon. Her strength is used for the hardest tasks, moving the massive floodgates that control water flow, hauling timber for repairs, lifting boats out of the water. But her presence is also protective. There are stories of her stepping between an overseer's whip and a child too young to work but being beaten anyway. Stories of her carrying workers who've collapsed from heat exhaustion back to their cabins. Stories of her standing silently but immovably when Crane tries to separate mothers from their children during sales to other plantations. She speaks rarely. When she does, her voice is low and steady, carrying an authority that seems at odds with her status as property. Some of the older enslaved people at Marsh Bend begin to call her Tall Sarah, or simply the Wall. Because once she decides to stand somewhere, nothing can move her except by force. And Josiah Crane is beginning to realize that force alone might not be enough. The first serious confrontation between Crane and Sarah occurs in the summer of 1824, about 15 months after her arrival at Marsh Bend. A Charleston gentleman named Augustus Peyton has heard about the giant slave woman and travels to Marsh Bend with an offer. He'll pay Crane $300 to bring Sarah to Charleston for 2 weeks to display her at a traveling exhibition featuring curiosities of nature and science. Sarah would be the living centerpiece. Crane agrees immediately. The prospect of earning money while simultaneously raising his own profile in Charleston society is too tempting to refuse. He informs Sarah of the arrangement, expecting her to comply as she always has. But this time, something is different. According to testimony from a house servant named Ruth, who is present during the conversation, Sarah looks directly at Crane and says, very quietly, "I will not go." Crane is stunned. In the year and a half he's owned Sarah, she has never directly refused an order. He repeats the command, his voice rising. Sarah repeats her refusal, her voice remaining steady and low. Crane's face flushes red. He calls for the overseer. He orders Sarah taken to the whipping post immediately. What happens next becomes the subject of intense discussion among the enslaved community at Marsh Bend and is whispered about for years. 4 men, including Overseer Grimble, attempt to force Sarah toward the post. She doesn't fight them exactly. She simply stops moving. She plants her feet and becomes dead weight. The 4 men pull, push, strike her with fists and a cane. But Sarah will not budge. It takes 8 men using ropes, and finally resorting to threatening to harm other enslaved people if she doesn't comply, before Sarah finally walks to the post. The punishment is severe. 30 lashes with a braided leather whip. Witnesses report that Sarah makes no sound during the beating, even as blood soaks through the rough cotton dress she wears. When it's over and she's finally released from the post, she walks back to her cabin without assistance. Her back shredded, but her posture as upright as ever. She does not go to Charleston. Crane, humiliated in front of his overseer and workers, eventually tells Peyton the deal is off, inventing an excuse about Sarah falling ill. But something has shifted at Marsh Bend. The other enslaved people have seen that Sarah can be hurt, yes, but they've also seen that she can make Josiah Crane back down. And that frightens Crane more than he's willing to admit. Over the next year, an uneasy equilibrium develops. Crane continues to exhibit Sarah to visitors who come to Marsh Bend, but he stops trying to take her off the plantation. Sarah continues to work the fields with the same quiet, implacable strength. The punishments continue, but they become less frequent, as if Crane understands that each one diminishes his authority rather than reinforces it. But beneath the surface of that daily routine, something else is growing, something that will come to terrible fruition on a hot August night in 1827. Because in the spring of 1826, Sarah becomes pregnant. The father of Sarah's child is never officially recorded, but testimony from other enslaved people at Marsh Bend tells a consistent story. His name is Marcus, about 30 years old, a carpenter on the plantation, skilled in the intricate woodwork required to maintain the rice mills and floodgate systems. Marcus had arrived at Marsh Bend 2 years before Sarah, purchased from an estate sale in Georgetown. He's known as a quiet, thoughtful man who can fix almost anything, and who lost his own wife and daughter when they were sold away from him years earlier. Marcus and Sarah's relationship is, by all accounts, born from mutual respect rather than passion. In a world where so much is taken from them, where their bodies and labor are owned by someone else, they find in each other something resembling partnership. They sit together in the evenings after the work is done, speaking quietly outside the cabins. Marcus tells Sarah about the places he's been, the things he's built. Sarah, who's been moved so many times in her young life that she barely remembers her own mother's face, listens. When Sarah discovers she's pregnant in early 1826, the news spreads quickly through the slave quarters. Pregnancy on a plantation is always complicated. It represents both hope and fresh horror. A child means continuity, family, the possibility of something beyond the endless grind of labor. But it also means vulnerability. It means another life that can be threatened, sold, used as leverage. And on a plantation owned by someone like Josiah Crane, it means danger. Sarah's pregnancy is difficult from the beginning. Her size, the very thing that made her valuable to Crane, makes carrying a child physically challenging. She continues working in the fields through her first months of pregnancy, as all enslaved women are expected to do. But the other women at Marsh Bend notice that she moves more slowly, that she sometimes pauses and presses her hand to her lower back, her face showing a rare flicker of pain. Crane notices too, but for different reasons. A pregnant slave woman means, in his calculation, another piece of property. Another person he can own, sell, or use. He begins talking openly about the child, telling visitors he expects the infant to be of unusual size given the mother's extraordinary dimensions, speculating about what price such a child might fetch when old enough to sell. These comments, overheard by house servants and relayed back to the quarters, fill Sarah with a cold dread she's never felt before. She's endured beatings, humiliation, exhaustion, hunger. But the thought of her child being treated as Crane has treated her, exhibited like an animal, punished for entertainment, perhaps eventually sold away, That is something different. Something unbearable. In late January of 1827, during one of the coldest nights of winter, Sarah goes into labor just after midnight. The labor is long and extremely difficult. Sarah, who has never cried out during beatings, screams that night. The sound carries across the frozen fields and reaches the main house, where Crane is awakened by the noise. According to his own later testimony, he lights a lantern and walks to the slave quarters, standing outside cabin 7, listening to the sounds within. Just before dawn, the baby is born, a boy. He's large for a newborn, nearly 11 pounds, but otherwise appears healthy and normal. When the baby cries, witnesses later testify, Sarah weeps for the first time anyone at Marsh Bend has ever seen. She holds her son against her chest, examining his tiny hands, his face, whispering words no one else can hear. Marcus is allowed into the cabin shortly after the birth. He stands beside Sarah, looking down at the child, and those who are present report that something passes between them in that moment. Some unspoken understanding or decision. Sarah names her son Jacob. It's a biblical name, common among enslaved people, carrying connotations of struggle and survival. For a few brief weeks, despite everything, there is something like happiness in cabin 7. Sarah nurses Jacob, holds him for hours, sings to him in a low voice that sounds like distant thunder. Marcus carves small toys for the baby, tiny wooden animals that he places in the cradle he's built. It's still a slave cabin, still barely adequate shelter, but it's theirs, and inside those rough walls they try to build something resembling a family. But Josiah Crane is watching and waiting. By summer 1827, Jacob is 6 months old. He's growing quickly, already larger than most babies his age. He's begun to smile and reach for things with chubby hands. Sarah has returned to work, but lighter work than before, mostly around the plantation buildings. She keeps Jacob with her whenever possible, carrying him on her hip or back while she works, never letting him out of her sight for long. Marcus has built a better cabin for them, using scrap wood and his skills to improve the structure, adding a real door with a latch, a small window with shutters. Inside those rough walls, they try to maintain what little they have. But in Charleston, Josiah Crane's finances are deteriorating. The rice market has been unstable for several years. Crane has made some disastrous investments in a shipping venture that collapsed. He owes money to multiple creditors, and they're becoming insistent. By July 1827, Crane is facing the real possibility of losing Marsh Bend entirely if he can't raise capital quickly. The solution, in his mind, is simple: sell some of his enslaved workers. He could sell 5 or 6 people and clear enough debt to stabilize his position. The question is, which ones to sell? On a humid Tuesday afternoon in early August, a slave trader named Nathaniel Gadsden arrives at Marsh Bend. Gadsden is well known in the Charleston market, a man who specializes in purchasing enslaved people from financially troubled planters and then reselling them at auction or to plantation owners further south in Georgia and Florida. He has a reputation for driving hard bargains and for not caring where families end up after he purchases them. Crane and Gadsden spend several hours walking through the plantation, inspecting the enslaved workers, discussing their ages, skills, and potential prices. When they reach the area near the kitchen garden where Sarah is working, with Jacob sleeping in a cloth sling on her back, Gadsden stops and stares. The conversation that follows is overheard by a young boy named Peter, who's supposed to be hauling water but has hidden behind a woodpile close enough to hear. Peter's testimony, given many years later, provides the only direct account of what is said. Gadsden asks, "Lord Almighty, is that the giant woman I heard about?" Crane responds, "That is Sarah, 6'8", strongest worker I have." Gadsden continues, "And the child?" Crane answers, "Her son, about 6 months old." Gadsden walks closer, circling Sarah while she continues working, her face expressionless. He seems particularly interested in Jacob. Then he asks the question that will change everything: how much for the child? Sarah's hands stop moving. She doesn't turn around, but her entire body goes rigid. Crane says, "I hadn't considered selling him separately." Gadsden replies, "I have a buyer in Savannah. Wealthy family looking for a house servant they can train from infancy. They pay premium prices for children. Light work, good conditions. I could give you $400 for that baby. Today." There is a long silence. Sarah has turned slowly to face them now, still holding her hoe, her face absolutely blank. Crane says, $400. Gadsden confirms, "Today, cash. I take him with me when I leave this afternoon." Peter reports that Sarah makes a sound then, low in her throat like an animal, but she doesn't speak. Crane looks at her, then back at Gadsden. "I need to consider this," he says. But everyone who hears that conversation knows the truth. Josiah Crane needs $400 more than he needs to keep a 6-month-old baby on his plantation. It's just a matter of time. That night in cabin 7, Sarah and Marcus speak in urgent whispers until long after dark. No one knows exactly what they say, But the decision they reach will echo through history. The next morning, August 13th, 1827, Marcus is gone. He's vanished during the night, taking nothing with him except the clothes on his back. An enslaved man running away from a plantation isn't unusual, though it's extremely dangerous. The roads are patrolled. Slave catchers operate throughout the low country with dogs and weapons. The punishment for captured runaways is savage. But Marcus doesn't run alone. Hidden in the lining of his coat, sewn there by Sarah herself, is a detailed map Marcus has drawn of the plantation, the surrounding area, and the path to Charleston, along with a letter. The letter is addressed to anyone in Charleston who might help, explaining that Josiah Crane is planning to sell an infant child and begging for intervention, for assistance, for anything that might stop it. It's a desperate plan, almost certainly doomed to fail. But it's the only plan they have. Crane is informed of Marcus's disappearance just after dawn. His reaction is explosive. He orders Overseer Grimble to organize a search party immediately, to contact the slave patrol, to send riders to Charleston to watch the roads. The plantation is in chaos all morning as men on horseback spread out through the surrounding swamps and fields searching for any sign of Marcus. They find him just after noon, about 8 miles from Marsh Bend, trying to cross a creek. The slave patrol has dogs. Marcus has left a trail through the soft mud near the water. They bring him back to Marsh Bend, bound with ropes, bleeding from dog bites on his arms and legs, but still alive. What happens next becomes the subject of testimony in multiple legal proceedings over the following months. Crane orders Marcus taken to the whipping post immediately. He announces that he will personally administer the punishment and that it will be severe enough to serve as a warning to anyone else who might consider running. The entire enslaved community is forced to gather and watch. Sarah is made to stand at the front holding Jacob. The punishment is brutal, even by the standards of that time and place. 50 lashes, delivered with a heavy leather whip. Marcus is tied to the post, his shirt torn away. Crane swings the whip himself, putting his full strength into each stroke. Blood appears on Marcus's back after the 5th lash. After the 10th, his skin is torn open in multiple places. After the 20th, he has stopped screaming and hangs limp against the ropes. Sarah watches all of it, her face like carved stone, her arms wrapped around Jacob, who is crying now, frightened by the sounds and the atmosphere of violence. Witnesses report that Sarah's eyes never leave Marcus's face, and that Marcus, in the brief moments when he's conscious, looks only at her. When it's over, Marcus is cut down and dragged to his cabin, barely conscious. Crane turns to address the assembled crowd, his own face flushed and sweating, blood flecks on his shirt. He announces that anyone who helps a runaway, anyone who even knows about a planned escape and doesn't report it, will receive the same punishment. Then he dismisses everyone back to work, everyone except Sarah. Crane approaches her, standing close enough that she has to look down at him. He's a man of average height, and next to Sarah he looks almost childlike, but his voice is hard and cold. "Tomorrow morning," he says, Mr. Gadsden returns, "and he will take your son. You will not resist. You will hand the child over quietly. If you cause any trouble, if you make any scene, I will have Marcus beaten again. And this time, he will not survive it. Do you understand me?" Sarah says nothing. She simply stares down at Crane with those dark, unreadable eyes. After a long moment, Crane turns and walks back to the main house. That night, the plantation is unnaturally quiet. Even the normal sounds of the swamp seem muted, as if the world itself is holding its breath. In cabin 7, Sarah sits on the floor, holding Jacob, rocking him slowly while he sleeps. In another cabin, Marcus lies on his stomach, his shredded back treated with grease and herbs by the other enslaved people, drifting in and out of consciousness. And in the main house, Josiah Crane sits in his library, going over his account books, calculating how the $400 from selling Jacob will ease his immediate financial pressures. None of them know that the next night will end in blood mystery and a legend that will never truly be solved. August 14th, 1827. The day dawns hot and oppressively humid, the kind of low-country summer day where the air feels thick enough to choke on. The sun rises blood red over the rice fields, filtered through the haze of moisture rising from the swamps. Later, people will remember that detail, as if nature itself had been warning them of what was to come. Sarah rises before dawn, as she always does. She nurses Jacob, changes him, dresses him in the cleanest clothes she has, a small cotton gown she's sewn herself. She holds him close and whispers to him for a long time, words no one else hears. Then she carefully places him in the wooden cradle Marcus has made, and she goes to work. All morning, Sarah works in the kitchen garden with a kind of mechanical efficiency. The other women working near her report that she speaks to no one, acknowledges no one, simply moves through her tasks with her face expressionless and her movements precise. Several people try to speak to her, to offer sympathy or support, but she doesn't respond. It's as if she's retreated somewhere deep inside herself, somewhere no one can reach. Around mid-morning, Nathaniel Gadsden arrives at Marsh Bend in a wagon driven by his assistant. Gadsden goes directly to the main house and is shown into Crane's library, where the two men finalize their transaction. $400 in cash, exchanged for ownership papers hastily written up for an infant named Jacob, age 6 months, property of Josiah Crane, now sold to Nathaniel Gadsden. At noon, Crane sends word that Sarah should bring the child to the main house. The message is delivered by a house servant named Ruth, who has the unenviable task of walking to the kitchen garden and telling Sarah that it's time to give up her son. Sarah's reaction is unexpected. She simply nods. She puts down her hoe, wipes her hands on her dress, and walks calmly to cabin 7. She emerges a few minutes later carrying Jacob, who is awake and looking around with curious eyes. She walks toward the main house without hurrying, without hesitating, her face still showing no emotion at all. The other enslaved people watch her go, many of them weeping. Some expect her to run, to fight, to do something. But Sarah just walks steadily across the yard, up the steps of the main house, and disappears inside. What happens in the next 15 minutes comes from multiple testimonies, primarily from Ruth, who is present in the house, and from Overseer Grimble, who is called inside during the exchange. Sarah enters the library where Crane and Gadsden are waiting. She stands just inside the doorway, holding Jacob against her chest. Crane gestures for her to approach. She takes 3 steps forward and stops. The men wait for her to come closer. But she does not move. After an uncomfortable silence, Crane speaks. "Sarah, give the child to Mr. Gadsden." Sarah looks at Gadsden, then at Crane. In a voice so quiet they have to strain to hear, she says, "Please." It's the first time anyone at Marsh Bend has ever heard Sarah beg for anything. Crane's face hardens. The matter is settled. "Sarah, give him the child now." Sarah's arms tighten around Jacob. Her voice rises slightly. "Please, I will work harder. I will do anything. Please do not take my child." Gadsden shifts uncomfortably. Crane stands up from behind his desk, his voice sharp. "You forget yourself. You do not beg. You obey. Hand over the child." This instant, for a long moment, Sarah does not move. Then, slowly, she looks down at Jacob. She kisses his forehead. She whispers something to him, and then, with hands that are shaking for the first time anyone has ever seen, she holds him out toward Gadsden. Gadsden steps forward and takes Jacob from her arms. The baby, sensing the change, begins to cry. The sound seems to break something in the room. Sarah's face crumples, just for a second, showing raw anguish before she forces it back into blankness. But her hands, now empty, are still extended, as if she cannot quite comprehend that they no longer hold her son. Crane, perhaps feeling a twinge of something like guilt, or perhaps just wanting the scene to end, says more gently, "The child will be well cared for, Sarah. He goes to a good situation. You will work, and perhaps in time you can have other children. Now go back to your work." Sarah lowers her hands slowly. She looks at Crane with an expression that Ruth will later describe as beyond hatred, beyond despair, something cold and final. Then she turns and walks out of the library, out of the main house, and back toward the slave quarters. Gadsden leaves Marsh Bend shortly after noon with Jacob wrapped in a blanket in the wagon, crying for his mother. Sarah is seen standing near cabin 7, watching the wagon roll down the long driveway toward the main road. She stands there without moving for nearly an hour after the wagon has disappeared from sight. The afternoon passes in a strange, tense atmosphere. Everyone at Marsh Bend knows something terrible has occurred, but the routines of plantation life continue regardless. The work has to be done. The rice will not harvest itself, so people return to the fields, to their tasks, moving mechanically through the motions while their minds are elsewhere. Sarah returns to work as well. But something has changed. Several people later testify that her movement seems different, more deliberate, almost ritualistic. She works steadily through the afternoon, refusing food when it's offered, speaking to no one. As the sun begins to set, painting the sky in deep oranges and purples, she finally stops working. She walks to the cabin where Marcus lies, recovering from his beating. She enters without knocking and sits beside his pallet. Marcus is awake, his face drawn with pain, but his eyes alert. According to testimony from others in the cabin who pretend to sleep but listen, Sarah and Marcus speak in low voices for nearly an hour. The exact words are never recorded, but the tone is described as final, as if they're saying goodbye. At one point, Marcus reaches out and takes Sarah's hand in his, and they sit like that in silence for a long time. When Sarah finally stands to leave, Marcus says something that several people hear clearly. "You do what you have to do." Sarah returns to cabin 7 as full darkness descends. She does not eat the evening meal. She sits on the floor with her back against the wall, staring at the empty cradle Marcus had built, her face illuminated by the dim light of a single candle. Around 9 o'clock, she stands up, blows out the candle, and leaves the cabin. Several people see her walking across the plantation grounds toward the main house. Her figure is unmistakable even in the darkness, towering and moving with that strange, quiet grace. One man, an elderly field worker named Solomon, later testifies that he calls out to her, asking where she's going. Sarah does not answer, she simply keeps walking. At approximately 9:30, according to the clock that will later be found stopped at that exact time in Josiah Crane's library, Sarah Drummond enters the main house through the kitchen door. The main house at Marsh Bend is quiet that night. Crane has dismissed most of the house servants earlier than usual, keeping only Ruth and one other servant, an older man named Isaac who serves as butler. Crane himself is in his library, the same room where he had taken Jacob from Sarah's arms just 9 hours earlier. He's working on his account books, occasionally sipping from a glass of brandy, reviewing the entries that now include $400 from the sale. Ruth is upstairs in one of the bedrooms, turning down the bed and preparing the room for the night. Isaac is in the kitchen building, which is separate from the main house, as is common in plantation architecture, finishing the cleaning from the evening meal. Neither of them sees Sarah enter through the kitchen door and move through the darkened house toward the library. What happens in the next several minutes has been reconstructed from physical evidence, from the testimonies of those who arrived shortly after, and from one crucial witness, Ruth, who hears sounds from downstairs and comes to investigate. According to Ruth's testimony, given 3 days later to the Charleston magistrate, she hears Crane's voice first, raised in anger but not quite shouting. She cannot make out the words, but the tone is unmistakable. Then she hears another voice, much lower, which she recognizes immediately as Sarah's. Ruth starts down the stairs, moving quietly, uncertain whether she should intervene or not. As she reaches the bottom of the stairs, she hears Crane shout, "How dare you enter this house? Get out immediately, or I will have you whipped until you cannot stand." Sarah's response is too quiet for Ruth to hear clearly, but it causes Crane to shout again. "The child is sold. The matter is finished. You have no rights here. You own nothing, not even yourself." There is a sound then that Ruth describes as furniture scraping, as if a chair has been pushed back suddenly. Then Crane's voice again, but different now, higher, frightened. "Stay back. Do not come closer. I am warning you." Ruth, terrified but compelled by some instinct she cannot name, moves to where she can see through the partially open library door. What she sees, she will later say, will stay with her for the rest of her life. Sarah stands in the center of the library, her head nearly touching the ceiling. Crane is backed up against his desk, his face pale, one hand reaching behind him as if searching for something. The lamp on the desk casts wild shadows, making Sarah's figure seem even larger, almost inhuman in its proportions. "I want my son back," Sarah says. Her voice is perfectly calm, perfectly steady. "Impossible," Crane says. "He is sold. The law supports me. You are my property, and that child was my property, and I had every right to one. I want my son back." Crane's hand finds what he's searching for, a pistol he keeps in the desk drawer. He pulls it out and points it at Sarah with a shaking hand. "I will shoot you if you take another step. I swear before God, I will shoot you where you stand." Sarah looks at the pistol. Then she takes a step forward. "Stop," Crane's voice cracks. "I will do it. I will." Sarah takes another step. She's close enough now that she could reach out and touch him. Crane pulls the trigger. The sound of the gunshot is deafening in the enclosed space. Ruth screams. But when the smoke clears, Sarah is still standing. The ball has struck her in the left shoulder, tearing through muscle and striking bone, but she has not fallen. She has barely moved. Blood is spreading across her dress, black in the lamplight, but her face shows no pain. Only that same terrible, blank determination. Crane stares at her in horror. He tries to cock the pistol again for a second shot, but his hands are shaking too badly. Sarah reaches out and takes the pistol from his hands as easily as one might take a toy from a child. She throws it across the room where it strikes the wall and clatters to the floor. "Where is my son?" Sarah asks. "I do not know," Crane says. "He's backed against the desk now with nowhere to go. Gadsden took him. I do not know where. I swear I do not know." Sarah stands there for a long moment looking down at Crane. Blood is dripping from her shoulder, pattering on the floor. When she speaks again, her voice is so quiet that Ruth can barely hear it. "You took everything from me. You took my body, my labor, my dignity, my child. You took everything. What do you have left to take? Please," Crane whispers. "Please, I can get him back. I can find him, I can—" But Sarah is not listening anymore. She reaches out with both hands and takes Crane by the head, her enormous hands wrapping around his skull the way one might hold a melon. Crane tries to scream, but the sound is cut off almost instantly. Ruth turns and runs. She runs out of the house, across the yard, screaming for help. Behind her, from inside the library, she hears a sound she will describe as like a pumpkin being smashed, followed by the heavy thump of something large falling to the floor. By the time Overseer Grimble and two other men arrive at the main house, perhaps 3 minutes later, the library is silent. They enter cautiously, Grimble carrying a rifle, expecting violence. What they find is worse than violence, it is finality. Josiah Crane lies on the floor beside his desk, on his back, his eyes open and staring at nothing. His head is misshapen, crushed with such force that blood and brain matter have sprayed across the desk and nearby books. The physical evidence is unmistakable. He has been killed by compression, by hands of extraordinary size and strength, squeezing his skull until it fractured and collapsed inward. Sarah is gone. The window behind the desk, which looks out over the back of the property toward the swamps, is open. A trail of blood leads from Crane's body to the window and out into the darkness beyond. The men stand in shocked silence for a moment, trying to comprehend what they're seeing. Then Grimble takes control. He sends one man to ride to Charleston immediately to alert the authorities. He sends another to gather all the enslaved men to form a search party. He posts guards at the main house to preserve the scene. But even as he gives these orders, Grimble knows in his heart that they will not find Sarah Drummond. The swamps around Marsh Bend are vast, dark, and treacherous. A person who knows them well could disappear into that wilderness and never be found. And Sarah has just killed a white plantation owner in front of a witness. She has nothing left to lose. The search begins within the hour, but it's chaotic and disorganized. Men with torches and dogs spread out into the swamps, calling out, crashing through the underbrush. They find the blood trail easily enough, droplets leading away from the house into the rice fields and then toward the tree line. But at the edge of the swamp, the trail disappears. The ground is too wet, too tangled with vegetation, and in the darkness, it's impossible to track anything with certainty. They search all night and find nothing. No body, no clothing, no sign that Sarah has been there at all, except for that blood trail that ends at the swamp's edge, like a line drawn in the sand. As dawn breaks on August 15th, the searchers return to Marsh Bend, exhausted and empty-handed. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next, because the mystery of Sarah Drummond is only beginning. The Charleston authorities arrive at Marsh Bend on the afternoon of August 15th, led by a magistrate named William Huger and accompanied by the sheriff, 2 deputies, and a physician named Dr. James Priolo. What they find is a plantation in chaos, with the enslaved community terrified and silent, the overseer overwhelmed, and a crime scene that defies easy explanation. Dr. Priolo's examination of Josiah Crane's body is thorough and disturbing. His official report, preserved in the Charleston County Archives, describes injuries consistent with massive compression force applied to the cranium, resulting in multiple fractures, brain hemorrhage, and immediate death. The doctor notes that the marks on Crane's skull correspond to fingers of unusual length and width, and that the force required to produce such injuries would exceed the capacity of most men, requiring strength of an extraordinary nature. The investigation focuses initially on finding Sarah, but as the days pass with no trace of her, the authorities begin to interview everyone at Marsh Bend. The testimonies they collect paint a disturbing picture of life on the plantation and of Sarah herself. Ruth gives her account of what she witnessed, though she's clearly terrified of the consequences. Her testimony is corroborated by Isaac, who heard the gunshot and saw Sarah's bloody trail leading from the house. Other enslaved people testify about Sarah's size, her strength, the years of abuse she suffered, and the sale of her child the morning of the murder. The discovery of the gunshot wound complicates matters. The authorities find the pistol where Sarah threw it and the ball lodged in the wall behind where she had been standing. This means Crane shot Sarah before she killed him, which raises uncomfortable legal questions about self-defense. Could an enslaved person claim self-defense against their owner? The law says no, but the circumstances make even the most hardened magistrates uneasy. Marcus is questioned extensively. He's still recovering from his beating, barely able to sit up, but the authorities suspect he knows something about Sarah's whereabouts. Marcus maintains that he was in his cabin all night, too injured to move, and knew nothing of what Sarah had done until he heard the commotion afterward. Several other enslaved people confirm his story. The authorities have no choice but to accept it, though they remain suspicious. As word of the murder spreads through Charleston and the surrounding low country, public reaction is divided and intense. Among the plantation-owning class, there is outrage and fear. If an enslaved woman could kill her owner with impunity and then disappear, what does that mean for the stability of the entire system? Emergency meetings are called. Patrols are increased. New restrictions are placed on enslaved people's movements. But among other communities, particularly free black people and those opposed to slavery, the story takes on different dimensions. Sarah becomes To some, a symbol of resistance. To others, a cautionary tale about the inevitable violence that slavery produces. To still others, she's simply a mother who has been pushed beyond endurance. The search for Sarah continues for weeks, expanding far beyond Marsh Bend. Slave catchers are hired. Rewards are posted. Reports come in from across the region of sightings of a woman matching Sarah's distinctive appearance. A woman of extraordinary height seen near the Santee River. A giant woman spotted on a road leading north toward North Carolina. A tall woman asking for food at a church in the back country. But none of these sightings are ever confirmed. When investigators follow up, they find nothing. It's as if Sarah has been swallowed by the landscape itself, becoming part of the swamps and forests that surround Marsh Bend. Then in September of 1827, something unexpected happens. A letter arrives at the Charleston magistrate's office. It has no return address and has been left at a post office in Columbia, over 100 miles from Charleston. The handwriting is crude but legible, the spelling uncertain but understandable. It reads, "To those seeking the woman Sarah, I am not dead. I will never return. I am going north to find my son. If any man tries to stop me, he will meet the same fate as Josiah Crane. Do not follow me." The letter is not signed, but Magistrate Huger is convinced it's authentic. The phrasing, the determination, the threat, all seem consistent with what he knows of Sarah. But it raises more questions than it answers. Has Sarah really made it all the way to Columbia? Is she still alive despite her gunshot wound? And most troubling, does she really intend to search for her son? The authorities do not publicize the letter. They fear it will inspire other enslaved people or create panic among plantation owners. But they share it confidentially with slave traders and catchers across the region, asking them to watch for a woman of Sarah's description, particularly one asking questions about a child named Jacob sold in August. Nathaniel Gadsden, the trader who purchased Jacob, is questioned extensively. He confirms that he sold the child to a family named Hafford in Savannah, Georgia for $500, just 2 days after leaving Marsh Bend. The Haffords are contacted. They confirm that they purchased an infant boy in mid-August and that the child is healthy and in their possession, but they're understandably alarmed by the story of Sarah and what she has done. They hire armed guards to watch their property for months afterward. As 1827 turns to 1828 and then to 1829, the active search for Sarah gradually ceases. She has not been found. She has not been reported anywhere with certainty. The authorities conclude that she likely died from her gunshot wound somewhere in the wilderness, her body never recovered. The case is officially closed, though a standing warrant for her arrest remains on the books for decades. But the story does not end there, because over the years, over the decades, the rumors persist. In the years following Sarah's disappearance, stories begin to emerge from across the South about encounters with a woman of extraordinary size. These stories are whispered in slave quarters, shared in free black communities, sometimes even reported by white travelers who claim to have seen something inexplicable. In 1831, a group of escaped enslaved people arriving in Pennsylvania via the Underground Railroad report that they were helped along their journey by a woman they describe as a giant, taller than any person we have ever seen, who moved through the forest like a spirit and knew every hidden path. When asked her name, she told them only, "I am looking for my son." In 1835, a plantation overseer in northern Georgia reports an encounter with a woman matching Sarah's description who appeared at the edge of his property asking about recent slave sales. When he tried to detain her, she lifted him off the ground with one hand and threw him aside like a child. By the time he recovered and gathered help, she had vanished. In 1842, a Quaker woman operating a safe house on the Underground Railroad in Ohio writes in her diary about a visitor who stayed one night. "A woman of most extraordinary stature and bearing arrived at our door seeking shelter and information about the location of a child sold from Charleston years ago. She would not give her name. She bore old scars that suggested violence. She wept when we told her we had no information about her son. In the morning, she was gone." These stories, and dozens like them, become part of the legend of Sarah Drummond. But are they real encounters, or are they myths built on a foundation of hope and fear? The historical record provides no definitive answers. What is documented is that in the decades following 1827, several plantations in South Carolina and Georgia report thefts of food, clothing, and medicine, with witnesses describing the thief as a woman of unusual height. Some plantation owners become convinced that Sarah is living in the swamps and forests, surviving on stolen goods, and perhaps helping other runaways escape to freedom. One particularly detailed account comes from a diary kept by a plantation owner named Samuel Gillard, whose property bordered the Francis Marion National Forest in South Carolina. In an entry from 1838, Gillard writes, "My overseer swears he saw the giant negress that killed Josiah Crane all those years ago. He says she was watching our property from the tree line at dusk, standing so still she seemed part of the forest itself. When he approached, she simply turned and disappeared into the woods. He tracked her for a mile but lost the trail in a creek. I confess I do not know whether to believe him or attribute this to an overactive imagination fueled by too much whiskey. But he was genuinely shaken, and he is not a man given to flights of fancy. The legend of Sarah takes on different meanings in different communities. Among enslaved people, she becomes a symbol of resistance, a reminder that even the most oppressed person can strike back against their oppressor. Songs are sung about her in the slave quarters, though always carefully, always in code. In some versions of these songs, Sarah becomes a kind of avenging spirit, protecting runaways and punishing cruel masters. Among white Southerners, particularly plantation owners, Sarah becomes a cautionary tale about the dangers of pushing enslaved people too far, and also a monster story used to justify even harsher controls and punishments. Some claim she has become a cannibal living in the swamps. Others say she has gone mad and will attack any white person she encounters. These stories, however absurd, reveal deep anxieties about the system of slavery itself and what might happen if that system were truly challenged. Free black communities and abolitionists in the North tell yet another version of Sarah's story. In their telling, she becomes a hero who struck a blow for freedom and then escaped to the North, perhaps even making it to Canada. Some claim she was reunited with her son. Others say she became an active conductor on the Underground Railroad, using her knowledge of the southern wilderness to guide hundreds of people to freedom. The truth, as is often the case with legends, is likely far more mundane and tragic than any of these stories. But one fact remains incontrovertible: Sarah Drummond was never captured, never confirmed dead, and never seen again with any certainty by anyone who could prove it. In researching this story, I have examined every document, every testimony, every scrap of evidence that remains from that night in August 1827 and the years that followed. And while I cannot tell you with absolute certainty what happened to Sarah Drummond after she climbed through that library window and disappeared into the swamps, I can tell you what the evidence suggests. The gunshot wound Sarah received from Josiah Crane was serious. The coroner's report noted blood at the scene consistent with a significant injury. Dr. Priolo, who examined the scene the next day, stated that without medical treatment, such a wound would likely lead to infection and death within days or weeks. Sarah had no access to medical care. She was a fugitive in a hostile landscape, being actively hunted by men with dogs and weapons. The most likely scenario, the one that most historians who have studied this case accept, is that Sarah died within a few days of escaping Marsh Bend. She probably made it some distance into the swamps, perhaps following waterways where dogs could not track her scent, but eventually succumbed to her wound. Her body, if she died in the deep swamps, would have been quickly consumed by the ecosystem: alligators, wild pigs, and the simple process of decomposition in that hot, wet environment. Within weeks, there would have been nothing left to find. This explanation accounts for why no confirmed sightings of Sarah ever occurred, why the authorities never found any solid evidence of her continued existence, and why the blood trail from Marsh Bend ended so abruptly. It is the rational, evidence-based conclusion. And yet, there are details that do not quite fit this neat explanation. The letter received in Columbia was real. Someone wrote it. Someone who knew details about Sarah that were not public knowledge. If Sarah died in the swamps near Marsh Bend, who wrote that letter? The reports from the Underground Railroad operatives are also difficult to dismiss entirely. These were serious people, committed to their cause, not given to spreading false rumors. When they reported encounters with a woman matching Sarah's description, they did so in private correspondence and personal diaries, not in public statements meant to inspire or mislead. And there is one more piece of evidence that I have saved for last, because it is perhaps the most intriguing and the most difficult to verify. In 1889-60, 2 years after the death of Josiah Crane, a physician in Philadelphia named Dr. Robert Hayes was treating an elderly black woman on her sick bed. The woman was dying, and in her final days, she told Dr. Hayes a story. She claimed that her mother had been an escaped slave from South Carolina, a woman of extraordinary size who had killed her owner in the 1820s. The woman said her mother had survived for years in the wilderness before eventually making it north with the help of free black communities and Quaker abolitionists. She said her mother had searched for her first child, a son named Jacob, for more than a decade, but never found him. Eventually, she had settled in Pennsylvania, taken a new name, and lived quietly until her death in 1867. Dr. Hayes wrote about this conversation in a letter to a colleague, noting that he had found the woman's story remarkable but impossible to verify. The woman herself died 2 days after their conversation. Dr. Hayes never learned her name, and he made no effort to investigate her claims. The letter was discovered in 2003 by a historian researching Civil War era medical practices in Philadelphia. Could this woman have been Sarah Drummond's daughter? Could Sarah have really survived, really escaped, really lived to old age in Pennsylvania? We will never know for certain. The evidence is too thin, too circumstantial, separated by too many years. What we do know, what is incontrovertibly documented and real, is what happened on the night of August 14, 1827 in that library at Marsh Bend. We know that a woman who had been treated as property, exhibited as a curiosity, worked to exhaustion, beaten and humiliated, finally reached a point where she had nothing left to lose. We know that when her child was taken from her, when the last thing she had to care about was torn from her arms and sold for $400, something inside her broke. Or perhaps it did not break. Perhaps it crystallized into something hard and final and unstoppable. We know that Josiah Crane died that night, his skull crushed by Sarah's bare hands. We know that Sarah disappeared and was never found. And we know that for nearly 2 centuries, people have wondered and debated and told stories about what really happened to the giant slave woman of Charleston. The truth is probably simpler and sadder than the legends. But the legends persist because they speak to something fundamental about the human spirit and what happens when that spirit is pushed beyond endurance. Sarah Drummond, whether she died in those swamps or lived to old age in Pennsylvania, became more than just one woman. She became a symbol of resistance, of maternal love, of the breaking point where oppression transforms into rage and rage into action. And perhaps that is why her story has never been forgotten, even when the facts themselves have become uncertain. Because we want to believe that Sarah survived. We want to believe that she found her son, or at least that she lived free for some years before she died. We want to believe that someone who suffered so much and fought back so fiercely was rewarded with something more than a lonely death in a swamp. But history does not traffic in what we want to believe. History deals in what happened, in what can be documented and proven. And the documented truth is this: Sarah Drummond killed Josiah Crane on August 14, 1827, and then vanished from the historical record as completely as if she had never existed at all. Except she did exist. The sale records prove it. The medical examinations prove it. The testimonies prove it. And most of all, Josiah Crane's crushed skull proves it. Sarah Drummond was real. What she did was real. And somewhere, in the swamps of South Carolina or the forests of Georgia, or perhaps in a quiet grave in Pennsylvania, her bones are resting still. As for Jacob, Sarah's son, his fate can be traced with more certainty. Records show that the Hafford family of Savannah raised him as a house servant. He lived until 1891, dying at the age of 64, and was buried in a small cemetery outside Savannah. In his later years, after emancipation, Jacob worked as a carpenter and had his own family. According to interviews conducted with his descendants in the 1930s as part of the Federal Writers Project, Jacob knew the story of his mother and what she had done. He told his children that he carried with him always a small wooden toy carved in the shape of a horse that had been made by his father Marcus before he was sold away from Marsh Bend. He named his first daughter Sarah. This mystery shows us that even in the darkest periods of American history, there were individuals who refused to accept their dehumanization, who fought back against impossible odds, and who became legends precisely because they dared to resist. What do you think of this story? Do you believe Sarah survived and made it north? Or did she die in those swamps near Charleston? Do you think the physician's account from 1889 was real, or just another legend built on hope? Leave your comment below. If you enjoyed this tale and want more horror stories rooted in real American history, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries that blur the line between documented fact and enduring legend. See you in the next video.